In the preparation for our book entitled The Mystery of the Menorah and the Hebrew Alphabet, we became fascinated with the meanings of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And we found that the Bible has a design, an alphabetic design according to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And what we'd like to share with you today is a study we have made in the book of Lamentations to show you this magnificent alphabetic design. The book of Lamentations is more than just a mere book of 5 chapters. It shows the structure of the alphabet here from the Hebrew, and also it shows us the meanings of these Hebrew letters. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the magnificence of Lamentations.
Lamentations, the book of elegies and mourning, the book of, in the Greek, Septuagint version, this was called a dirge, as in funeral dirge. And that's where we get our title, Lamentations. The Hebrew, however, is a word that's hard to translate into English. The Hebrew title for this book is Ekah. And we see it in verse 1, chapter 1, and it's the word translated into English, JR, as how. Mm-hmm. And it's an expression of disbelief and of mourning and of shock.
Yes.
How in the world could this have happened?
Mm. And some have also equated it to the word alas. So it's just really difficult to express the deep sorrow and the heartache of the Jews. He looks at his ruined city. And the thing we see about this is that Jerusalem was built with a beautiful architectural design, and now it is destroyed. It's all gone. There is the magnificence of Solomon's temple and the walls of the city and the gates of the city and the streets of the city and the architectural design of the houses. It was a thing of beauty. It rivaled the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that's what we see here, I think, in the alphabetic design of Lamentations, because chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, and chapter 5 each have 22 verses. And believe it or not, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And what we see in chapter 1, Gary, is that verse 1 opens, the very first letter in that verse is an aleph, the first letter. And verse 2 opens with bait. Verse 3, gimel. Verse 4, dalet. So you can easily see in the Hebrew the alphabetic design. This is true also in chapters 2, 3, and 4. Now, there are 22 verses of chapter 5, but they do not have an alphabetic design. Why?
Chaos. As a matter of fact, if you could subtitle this book, everything is turned upside down. Everything is overturned. The city's destroyed. The people are destroyed. The law can no longer be kept. God's blessing is overturned. Everything is upside down and overturned. There is chaos. Well, chapter 5 of Lamentations is probably the saddest lamentation maybe in the history of human existence.
Yeah.
It is a funeral dirge that is unbelievable in its emotional impact, and its foundation or its structure is, even though it has 22 verses, it's chaotic. It's all mixed up. The letters are jumbled, and so the message is implicit within the structure. That is chaos.
So what we have here, Jerusalem is destroyed. I guess we could say no form and void.
Yeah.
That'd be a good way of translating it, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the Hebrew word tohu vabohu, which is translated into English as without form and void, actually concerning the creation of the earth, fits here. There is a void. Yeah. The only thing there is a glimmer of hope because of the grace of God. But interestingly, the book starts in chapter 1 with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Remember now, the rabbis speak of these as the word of creation. Taken in entirety, they are called the word of creation because with the 22 letters, God spoke creation into existence. And so we have here some sense of order.
Yeah.
But it's quickly overturned as you proceed through the book.
In chapter 1, then, we have every letter of the Hebrew alphabet in its order, one after the other. But when we get to chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, Gary, we have a beginning of the disintegration of this thing, don't we?
We sure do. Because verses 16 and 17 should be the letters, respectively, Ayin and Pe. But that's not what we see. All the other letters are in order, but instead of ayin and peh, it's peh and ayin. The two letters are inverted. And this is Jeremiah's way, or shall we say God's way, of calling attention to those two letters.
This is true also in chapter 3
yeah, it's
and
true.
4.
3 and 4. By the time you get to chapter 5, there's no order at all. But in chapters 2, 3, and 4, those two letters are displaced. And it calls attention to them. In fact, I have read commentaries where men have really wondered why this is the case.
Yes.
And they couldn't figure it out.
I would like to offer a suggestion. I believe that the ayin, which represents the eye, and the peh, which represents the mouth, are the two facets of the human being that express lamentations, tears from the eyes and wailing from the mouth. And so I think we see in this, in the eye and the mouth, or the ayin and the peh, reversed in chapters 2 and 3 and 4. I think we can see the great heartache of these lamentations.
Now, in a moment, we're going to actually look at these verses that have the ayin and the peh reversed. We've spoken of these in other studies, but I think it'd be worth once again reviewing a rabbinic commentary on the ayin and the peh. The letters of the Hebrew alphabet have meanings. The letter ayin is literally the word for eye. Actually, the name of this letter says the word for eye in Hebrew, ayin. And it's the letter that symbolizes sight and insight. It also symbolizes spiritual awareness. Then on the negative side, JR, it stands for the tempted eye, or the evil eye, the eye that maybe strays and is tempted by the things of this world. On another level, and I'm just scanning through the commentary here as I speak, on another level, in its plural form, Ayin, it speaks of the eyes of God as he looks to and fro through all the world. And finally, the number of this letter, JR, is 70. And it denotes spirituality. And if you remember, the Sanhedrin had 70 men, and it's the spirit of the community, when the community is all in order.
And it was Jeremiah who said they would be 70 years in Babylon.
That's true. Very true. Now, as we get to the next letter, peh, peh is the symbol of speech and of silence. Peh, the mouth, the organ of speech. It makes man higher than the animals because man can speak, the animals cannot speak. And the mouth is, in its best form, used to express the things of God. And the rabbis say there's a time for speech and a time for silence. There's a time to listen, to shut up and listen to God. Then there's a time to speak. And of course, speak the things of God. Now, as we continue to look at the letter peh, peh stands also for the voice of the prophet. For example, Moses was Israel's greatest prophet. If you recall, he had a little bit of an affliction in his speech. And this was the Lord's way of calling attention to his ordained purpose. The Lord says, maybe you've got a little problem with your speech, but there's no worry. I'll give you a way to speak my words to the people. And he did. So what we have here, metaphorically then, in the 16th and 17th letters of the Hebrew alphabet, we have ayin, the letter of the eye, peh, the letter of the mouth. Now, JR, as we look at the 16th and 17th verses throughout Lamentations, we're going to see some amazing things. Remember, too, Jeremiah was written 6 centuries before Christ, the 6th century B.C.,
Yes.
which means that this symbology we're talking about was in existence at the time of Jeremiah's writings.
That's right. So here we have the meanings of the Hebrew letters actually referred to in the message of Lamentations. And when we get down to the very last chapter, let me just mention this, Gary, that we have no alphabetic order here.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, the first verse does not begin with Aleph. The second verse does not begin with Beit. The third verse does not begin with Gimel, as we see in the other chapters. But when we get down to verses 16 and 17, which would be for the Ayin and the Peh, we have another reversal here, but the Peh is gone. There's no mouth here. In other words, there's nothing else to say. All we have are tears. And so verse 17 says, "For this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim."
Wow.
One lone reference. There is no reference to any other letter that we can determine in these 22 verses, but there are 22 verses just as there are 22 letters, but the only letter left to see here is the Ayin.
Yeah.
The I.
Now, JR, when everything is in order, the eye is the symbol of spiritual perception, and the mouth is the organ of worship and praising God. When everything is in disorder, there is wailing, there's gnashing of teeth. We even have that in Lamentations, which we'll look at in a moment. And the eye is filled with tears, and it's clouded, and its perception is dimmed. When we get to verse 16 of Lamentations 1, this is the Ayin verse. And I'm reading it. For these things I weep. Mine eye runneth down with water, because the Comforter that should relieve my soul is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. There it is, J.R., the letter Ayin.
Which means that Ayin means I.
Yeah.
It says it right here in this 16th verse, corresponding to the 16th letter, Ayin. And the 17th letter actually speaks of the mouth.
Of the mouth. And we read, Zion spreadeth forth her hands, and there is none to comfort her. And of course that comfort involves words. The Lord hath commanded concerning Jacob that his adversary should be round about him, Jerusalem.
And the Lord commanding is a reference to the mouth.
To the mouth. As a matter of fact, the verb in the Hebrew is a reference to speech. So we have the eye and the mouth here in verses 16 and 17.
Again, it's interesting that no other two letters of the alphabet are rearranged in this book. Everything else has its proper order in the first 4 chapters, except the eye and the mouth.
Right.
That's the only Hebrew letters that are reversed in chapters 2, 3, and 4. And I think it says that it is with the eye and the mouth the lamenting is expressed.
Now, in the second chapter, J.R., verses 16 and 17 should read in the order of the alphabet, Ayin first and then Pe second. But they're reversed. They're inverted because the whole world's turned upside down. And these letters are brought to our attention because they're inverted. It's a very clever way to do it.
So the first letter of that 16th verse, the first word begins with a Pe.
It's instead of an Ayin. And we read this, and Pe being the letter that represents the mouth. Verse 16, all thine enemies have opened their mouth against thee. They hiss and gnash the teeth. They say, we have swallowed her up. Certainly, this is the day we have looked for. We have found it. We have seen it. Does that speak of the mouth?
Yeah, and then the look for, and we have seen it, speaks of that next verse that begins with the Ayin. The first word of that verse begins with the letter Ayin, where it should have been a Pe. So these 2 verses are like reversed here.
And not only reversed, but they're a little jumbled.
Yeah, and it shows the topsy-turviness of all this.
It does. It's because you have some references to the eye in the Pe verse. In verse 17, the eye verse now, the Lord hath done that which he had devised. He hath fulfilled his word that he had commanded in the days of old. He hath thrown down and hath not pitied. He hath caused thine enemy to rejoice over thee, and had set up the horn of thine adversaries. You know, the letter Ayin, J.R., is said by the rabbis also to, remember, it represents the eyes of God and his plan for his people on earth. Well,
insight.
Insight.
And that's what we see described here, insight.
We do. Sure do.
That is, it is the Lord that has devised this thing. That's an insight into the reason why Jerusalem is destroyed. When we get to chapter 3, we've got 66 verses instead of 22.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, Gary. Why 66?
66 verses. Well, J.R., as to exactly why, we could speculate about that, but it may be best to say that the 66 verses remind us of the Word of God. At least that's what they remind me
66
of.
books in the Bible.
66 books in the Bible. And there's a hammering action here. These are short little verses, and they are the lament of the prophet himself. He's suffering and he is praying that God will save his people, that God will have mercy. The structure is like this. You have 3 Ayins, verses 1, 2, or 3 Aleph, verses 1, 2, and 3 here in the 3rd verse are Aleph, Aleph, Aleph. Then verses 4, 5, and 6 are bait, bait, bait.
In other words, each verse begins with that letter.
Each verse begins with that letter. And so we have a repetition of Aleph 3 times in the first 3 verses. And then in the next 3 verses, 3 bets. In the next 3 verses, 3 gimels, and so on. And so now we come down all the way to the 46th verse. 46th through the 51st verses start with Pez and then Ayins, and they're inverted. The Ayin should come first, but it's reversed again.
It's reversed, showing the destruction of Jerusalem, or of the order of the building of Jerusalem.
And J.R., the message is so clear here. Starting with Pe, verse 46, the mouth. All our enemies have opened their mouths against us. Verse 47. Fear and a snare has come upon us, desolation, destruction. Verse 48. Mine eye runneth down with rivers of water for the destruction of the daughter of my people. Verse 49. Mine eye trickleth down and ceaseth not without any intermission. Verse 50. Till the Lord look down. There are the eyes of God, and behold from heaven. Verse 51. Mine eye affecteth mine heart because of all the daughters of my city. That's spectacular.
The mouth first and then the eye.
Yeah.
How about that?
It's just amazing.
Absolutely incredible. And you know, the fascinating thing about this chapter 3 is that it appears to be the servant lamp of a menorah design. What we have here are 5 chapters, 5 divisions, and the middle one has 3 times as many verses as the other 2 on either side of it. So we have an elevating here, a lifting up of the servant lamp, just as you see this lamp behind me. And by the way, the lamps are not burning in this program because of the lamentations over the destruction of Jerusalem. The light is gone.
And by the way, that's the meaning of the overturned eye. It's dim. The light is out.
Yeah, and so we've chosen not to burn the lamps of the menorah as we discuss this program today, as a way of describing this incredible lamentation. And so, chapter 3 with 66 verses, being the servant lamp lifted up, I think shows the heart and mind of God as he too laments over Jerusalem. Now, chapter 1 represents Genesis. Chapter 2 represents Exodus, or that is the antithesis of it. Chapter 3, Leviticus, and Leviticus is God's book. That's the book that's entitled actually, and he called. It's the call of God. And so you can see, as Jeremiah turns attention toward himself, I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He hath led me and brought me into darkness and not into light. The servant lamp snuffed out, darkness and not light. And so we can see the Leviticus nature of this. When we get to chapter 4, we can see the numbers of this, or the wilderness, or the distress. I mean, this is exile.
Yes, it
the
is.
people leave Jerusalem, they're going to another land. This fourth chapter.
The kingdom's been destroyed.
Yeah, incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Take verses 16 and 17 again, Gary.
All right. Now,
And the pay.
all right. The Ayin and the Pei in Lamentations, verse 4, verses 16, chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. Again, we have Peh first and then Ayin. The anger of the Lord hath divided them. He will no more regard them. They respected not the persons of the priests. They favored not the elders. As for us, our eyes as yet failed for our vain help. In our watching, we have watched for a nation that could not save us.
Yeah.
The function of the eye.
Now, the eye is explicit here. The mouth seems to be implicit,
Yes, it
implied.
does.
But in every case here, it talks about the eyes. Not in every case does it talk about the mouth. And I think it's because, what else can there be said? Jerusalem is destroyed, and every mouth is shut.
And you know, remember the commentary on Peh in the rabbinic commentary. There's a time for speech, Peh, and a time for silence.
And this is the time for silence.
This is the time. God is not speaking anymore because now is judgment time, and the mouth is closed, and the meaning couldn't be clearer to me.
Isn't it amazing that we have each of these chapters, the first verse of each begins with an aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second verse of each begins with a beit. The third verse of each begins with a gimel, and so on it is through 22 letters. But when we get to chapter 5, The first verse does not begin with Aleph. The second verse does not begin with Beit. The third verse does not begin with Gimel. The fourth verse does not begin with Dalet. And so we have, through these 22 we have 22 verses, but we have a complete disintegration here of the alphabetic design.
Yeah.
Except for the Ayin.
The Ayin, JR, is still there in chapter 5, verse 17. It's an overturned Ayin. The normal position for Ayin is 16.
Would be verse 16.
So it's overturned, it's put in the pay place, which is 17, and it reads this way: For this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim.
Yeah.
Oh, what a lament.
When the Jews read the Lamentations, which they do on the 9th of Av, they come to the 22nd verse, which says, this is the last verse of the book. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. And the Jew cannot take that. That is not a fitting conclusion. That's a downer. He must lift it up for a hope. There's got to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And so he goes back to the 21st verse. He reads the 21st, then the 22nd, and then as a 23rd verse, he reads verse 21 again. And Gary, it says, Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old.
Yeah.
What a prayer.
And JR, that corresponds to the book of Deuteronomy. As it ends with Moses' great song of the future, talking about restoration, redemption, the very theme of Deuteronomy.
And I think that is the reason why the Lord says in Psalm 102, the time to favor her, yea, the set time is come. When he shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory. That is why the Jew is back in his land today. Lamentations is about to be turned into a new song, not a song of heartache, but a song of joy. That's the message I think we see in Lamentations. And the very metering of this 5th chapter here, Gary, is different from the metering of the others. Tell us about it.
JR, the metering in verse 5 is a horrendous, sad funeral dirge that has a very deadening rhythm, and it's said to be one of the saddest things ever written.
No wonder then, when Messiah comes, they will sing a new song.